We view the Black Death as the ultimate human tragedy, but for the survivors, it was the most significant market correction in history. In the mid-14th century, Europe was a saturated market of cheap, disposable labor where the elite held a total monopoly on the means of survival. The plague did not just kill people. It performed a violent liquidation of the feudal social contract, overnight turning the peasant from a liability into a high-value asset. While the church saw the wrath of God, the forensic economist sees a massive supply-side shock that broke the back of the landowning aristocracy. This was the birth of the competitive labor market, where the price of a day's work was no longer dictated by tradition, but by the raw physics of scarcity. But as the cost of labor began to skyrocket, the ruling class realized that their entire world was being bought out from under them by the very people they used to own. To understand this transition, we must view the year 1347 not as a year of mourning, but as the moment of a catastrophic margin call on the European economy. For centuries, the continent had been operating on a model of extreme over-leverage, where the value of land was artificially inflated by an endless supply of desperate workers. This surplus of human capital meant that the marginal productivity of an additional labor was nearly zero, giving the landowning class absolute monopsony of power. The average peasant was not a person in the eyes of the ledger, but a low-cost maintenance unit for the lord's estate. Economic mobility was a mathematical impossibility because there was always someone else willing to work for the bare minimum of caloric survival. However, this entire system of exploitation relied on a single, fragile variable: the continued existence of a massive, redundant population. The structural integrity of feudalism depended on the fact that labor was cheap and land was dear. In this environment, the elite could afford to be inefficient because the cost of maintaining their workforce was negligible. There was no incentive for technological investment or productivity gains when you could simply throw more bodies at a problem for the price of a few bushels of grain. This created a stagnant economic equilibrium where the standard of living for 90% of the population was pinned to the floor. The social hierarchy was essentially a price-fixing cartel run by the nobility to keep wages at a subsistence level. They believed this arrangement was ordained by the heavens and backed by the sword, making it seemingly invincible to any internal challenge. Yet, the greatest threat to this monopoly was not a peasant revolt or a rival king, but a microscopic organism that cared nothing for social status. Before the first plague ship arrived in Sicily, Europe was trapped in what economists call a Malthusian ceiling. The population had swelled to over 80 million people, a number that the primitive agricultural technology of the time could barely support. Every acre of arable land was being farmed to exhaustion, and yet the food supply remained dangerously thin. Because there were too many mouths to feed and too few resources to go around, the value of an individual life had hit an all-time low. Competition for work was so fierce that peasants would accept any terms, no matter how predatory, just to secure a small plot of dirt. This desperation allowed the lords to extract every ounce of surplus value from the peasantry, leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs. But this oversaturation of the market had created a pressure cooker that was ready to explode at the first sign of a supply contraction. The feudal monopoly was reinforced by a complex web of legal and religious restrictions that prevented workers from seeking better opportunities. A serf was legally bound to the land, effectively making them a fixed asset on the lord's balance sheet. Moving to a different manor or trying to negotiate for higher pay was considered a criminal act against the social order. The church provided the ideological framework for this stagnation, preaching that everyone should be content with their assigned station in life. This meant that the labor market was not just uncompetitive, it was completely frozen by a combination of law and dogma. The elites held all the cards, from the ownership of the mills to the control of the local courts. They assumed that the supply of cheap labor would remain infinite, ensuring their wealth for generations to come. In this pre-plague reality, the concept of bargaining power did not exist for the common man. If a worker died or became incapacitated, there were a dozen others waiting in line to take his place for even less compensation. This redundancy ensured that wages stayed at the absolute bottom, while the rents charged by the lords continued to climb. The economy was a giant machine designed to funnel wealth upward, leaving the producers of that wealth in a state of perpetual poverty. There is no such thing as a middle class. There was only the tiny fraction of owners and the massive, undifferentiated sea of the owned. The lords saw themselves as the masters of a permanent system, never suspecting that their entire business model was about to be liquidated by an invisible force that cared nothing for their titles. By the middle of the 14th century, the European economy was a house of cards waiting for a breeze. The soil was depleted, the climate was cooling, and the population was malnourished and vulnerable. The system was so brittle that even a minor disruption could have caused a significant correction in the labor market. What happened instead was a total systemic collapse that no one could have predicted or prepared for. The arrival of the plague was not just a health crisis. It was the ultimate stress test for a rigid and exploitative economic structure. As the first victims began to fall, the initial reaction of the elite was to tighten their grip and demand even more from the survivors. They failed to realize that the fundamental laws of supply and demand were about to override the laws of man. The first wave of the pandemic acted as a violent audit of the feudal ledger, stripping away the excess population that had kept wages low for centuries. In less than 5 years, between 30 and 60% of the European population was erased from the map. This was not a selective cull. It took the young, the healthy, and the skilled with the same indifference it showed the old and the infirm. For the first time in history, the supply of labor did not just decline, it vanished. The fields were left unharvested, the mills sat silent, and the great estates of the nobility began to revert to wilderness. The lords looked out from their manors and saw a world where their land was worth nothing because there was no one left to work it. The monopoly on the means of survival had been broken by the sheer scale of the mortality rate, leaving the surviving elite to realize that their gold was useless without the hands to spend it. As the smoke cleared from the plague pits, the survivors found themselves standing in a transformed economic reality. The massive oversupply of labor that had defined their lives for centuries was gone, replaced by a desperate, continent-wide shortage. Suddenly, the peasant who had been a disposable liability was the most valuable asset in the entire kingdom. The power dynamic that had favored the landowners since the fall of Rome was inverted in a matter of months. A lord who needed his crops harvested could no longer dictate terms to a line of desperate men. He had to compete for the few workers who remained. This was the beginning of the scarcity arbitrage, where the value of a human being was finally being recalibrated against the reality of the market. But the ruling class was not going to let go of their centuries of dominance without a fight. The immediate result of this labor shortage was a dramatic and unprecedented spike in nominal wages. In some regions, the daily rate for common labor doubled or even tripled as the surviving workers realized their new worth. They began to demand not just more money, but better working conditions and the freedom to move between estates. For the first time, a worker could walk away from a bad deal and find a better one just a few miles down the road. This newfound mobility was a direct threat to the very foundation of the feudal system, which relied on keeping people tied to a specific piece of land. The lords were horrified to find themselves in a bidding war for the services of people they had previously treated as little more than livestock. The era of the landlord-s market had ended, and the era of the worker-s market had begun with a vengeance. This shift in leverage was not just about the money. It was about the total revaluation of the social contract. The survivors were no longer willing to accept the old excuses for their poverty when they could see the sheer desperation of their masters. They began to consume more meat, drink better ale, and wear clothes that were previously reserved for the upper classes. This increase in the standard of living for the bottom half of the population was a direct transfer of wealth from the nobility to the peasantry. The lords saw their profit margins evaporate as their labor costs skyrocketed and their rental income plummeted. They were witnessing the literal consumption of their surplus value by the very people who had once been the source of it. The elite were desperate to find a way to freeze the market and return to the comfortable exploitation of the past. The economic friction created by this transition led to a series of panicked responses from the state and the church. They tried to moralize the situation, claiming that the peasants were becoming proud and lazy because they refused to work for the old, miserable wages. Sermons were preached against the vanity of the poor who dared to dress like their betters or eat white bread instead of coarse rye. But the workers knew that the gods of the market were now on their side, and no amount of shaming could change the fact that their labor was in high demand. They were practicing a form of primitive collective bargaining, simply by knowing that they were the only ones left who could do the job. The ruling class was preparing to launch a legal and physical assault on the newfound prosperity of the working class, turning the peaceful countryside into a high-stakes economic battlefield where the price of blood was the only currency left. The era of the landlord-s market had ended, and the era of the worker-s market had begun with a vengeance. While the fields were still littered with the remnants of the old world, the surviving peasantry realized that their labor was now the most scarce and valuable commodity in Europe. This newfound leverage was a direct threat to the very foundation of the feudal system, which relied on keeping people tied to a specific piece of land for a fixed, low price. The ruling class was preparing to launch a legal and physical assault on the newfound prosperity of the working class, turning the peaceful countryside into a high-stakes economic battlefield. They believed they could use the power of the law to freeze the market in its tracks, but they were about to discover that you cannot legislate against a 50% reduction in the labor supply. In 1351, the English Parliament enacted the Statute of Laborers, a desperate piece of legislation designed to roll back the clock on the labor market. The law mandated that every able-bodied person under the age of 60 must work for the same wages that were standard in 1346. This was a naked attempt at state-sponsored price fixing, aimed at stripping the peasantry of their newly acquired bargaining power. The elites were attempting to criminalize the basic laws of supply and demand, threatening fines and imprisonment for anyone who accepted a penny more than the pre-plague rate. It was the first time in history that the state intervened so aggressively to protect the profit margins of a failing aristocracy. However, the sheer scarcity of human capital meant that the market was already moving faster than the law could ever hope to travel. Enforcement of these wage caps became an administrative nightmare that the medieval state was simply not equipped to handle. Local courts were flooded with thousands of cases as lords attempted to sue their neighbors for poaching workers with higher pay. The very people tasked with enforcing the law were often the same landowners who were secretly breaking it to save their own harvests. When a crop is rotting in the field and the only available reaper demands double the legal rate, the rational economic actor chooses to pay the premium rather than suffer a total loss. This created a massive disconnect between the official legal reality and the actual price of labor on the ground. The state was trying to maintain a monopsony that had been shattered by the biological reality of the plague. To bypass the draconian penalties of the statute, a sophisticated shadow economy emerged across the rural countryside. Landowners began offering off-the-books incentives, such as free housing, extra grain rations, or the right to graze animals on the lord's private pasture. These non-monetary benefits functioned as a form of hidden inflation, allowing the real value of compensation to rise while the official wage remained technically legal. Peasants became expert negotiators, playing one landlord against another to secure the best total package of benefits and perks. The once rigid feudal contract was being rewritten in the dark, one secret handshake at a time. This underground market proved that even the most powerful government cannot suppress the true value of a scarce resource for long. As the state's attempts at price fixing crumbled, the European peasantry entered what historians now call the golden age of the laborer. With wages rising and the price of land falling, The average worker experienced a massive increase in their discretionary spending power. For the first time in centuries, the surplus value of production was staying in the pockets of the people who actually performed the work. This was a literal leveraged buyout of the aristocratic lifestyle by the common man. The wealth that had previously been concentrated in the hands of a few thousand nobles was being redistributed across millions of households. This sudden influx of capital into the lower classes triggered a fundamental shift in the entire structure of the European economy. The most visible sign of this economic revolution was the dramatic change in the European diet, moving from a grain-based subsistence to a high-protein meat standard. Before the plague, the peasant diet consisted almost entirely of pottage, a thin vegetable stew thickened with a small amount of barley or oats. After the labor correction, the survivors began demanding and receiving regular servings of beef, pork, and mutton as part of their daily compensation. This caloric wealth transfer meant that the working class was finally consuming the high-value agricultural products that had previously been reserved for the elite. The sheer volume of meat consumption per capita reached levels that would not be seen again until the 19th century. This dietary upgrade was not just about health. It was a physical manifestation of the worker's new dominance in the marketplace. The nobility watched this rise in peasant living standards with a mixture of horror and existential dread. To the medieval mind, social status was supposed to be clearly visible in one's outward appearance, but the new wealth was blurring those lines. A plowman who had successfully negotiated a high wage could now afford to buy silk ribbons, dyed wool, and even expensive furs. In response, the ruling class pushed through a series of sumptuary laws, which were essentially an attempt at brand protection for the aristocracy. These laws dictated exactly what type of fabric and jewelry each social rank was permitted to wear, aiming to prevent commoners from impersonating their social superiors. It was a desperate effort to use fashion as a tool for social control when the economic tools had already failed. Despite the legal threats, the new consumer culture among the peasantry continued to expand, creating a massive demand for manufactured goods. Local markets that had once sold only the barest necessities began to stock luxury items like pewter plates, fine glassware, and imported spices. This shift from subsistence to discretionary spending forced the development of new trade networks and specialized crafts in the towns. The peasant was no longer just a producer of raw materials. They had become a powerful consumer demographic with the ability to move the needle on the entire economy. This surge in demand provided the capital necessary for the early stages of the merchant revolution. The old feudal order was being hollowed out from the inside by the sheer purchasing power of the people it had once enslaved. The high cost of human capital also forced a radical rethink of how work was actually performed on the manor. Because labor was so expensive, landowners were forced to invest in labor-saving technologies or shift their operations to less labor-intensive industries. Many lords abandoned traditional grain farming entirely, turning their fields over to sheep grazing, which required far fewer workers to manage. This transition to pastoral farming accelerated the move toward a cash-based economy, as wool could be easily sold on the international market for liquid capital. The ancient system of labor services, where a peasant worked the lord's land in exchange for a plot of his own, was rapidly being replaced by the wage and rent model. This modernization was a direct result of the elite's inability to control the price of a day's work. As the old structures of the manor collapsed, a new class of yeoman farmers began to emerge from the ranks of the more successful peasants. These individuals used their accumulated savings to lease large tracts of land that the bankrupt nobility could no longer afford to manage. By consolidating these holdings, they were able to run their farms as efficient, profit-oriented businesses rather than feudal fiefdoms. This was the birth of a genuine middle class, a group of people who owed their status to market success rather than hereditary titles. They were the first generation of Europeans to realize that wealth was something that could be built through strategy and negotiation rather than just inherited. However, This rise of the commoner was creating a volatile political environment that was destined to boil over. The aristocracy found themselves trapped in a pincer movement between rising labor costs and a plummeting social status. Every attempt they made to claw back their former power only served to deepen the resentment of a workforce that now knew its own value. The tension between the legal fictions of the old world and the economic realities of the new world was becoming unsustainable. The peasants were no longer just asking for higher wages. They were beginning to question the very legitimacy of the people who sat in the manor houses. A new spirit of defiance was spreading through the villages, fueled by the realization that the masters needed the servants far more than the servants needed the masters. The stage was set for a violent confrontation that would determine whether the Great Correction would be settled with a ledger or a sword. The legal defiance of a new yeoman class was merely the symptom of a much deeper structural decay within the feudal revenue model. By the late 14th century, the old feudal contract was no longer just socially unstable. It was fundamentally insolvent. The high cost of labor had reached a tipping point where the traditional manor system could no longer generate a positive return on investment. This was the moment where the aristocracy realized that they could not legislate their way out of a labor shortage, and they began to look for ways to replace human capital with mechanical efficiency. The death of the old world was not a political event, but a capital expenditure decision that would change the trajectory of Western civilization forever. As the elite pivoted toward technology and cash markets, they were unwittingly funding the very revolution that would render their titles obsolete. This transition marked the first time in history that the price of sweat became so high that the price of steel became a bargain. The traditional manor was a closed-loop system that relied on the extraction of labor through coercion, but the plague broke that loop beyond repair. With half the workforce gone, the overhead of maintaining massive, sprawling estates became a crushing liability for the nobility. They were forced to liquidate their holdings or convert them into leaseholds, effectively turning their former subjects into rent-paying tenants. This shift from a labor-based economy to a cash flow economy meant that the lord was no longer a master, but a landlord. The peasant, meanwhile, was no longer a piece of property, but a customer in a competitive land market. This financialization of the countryside was the first nail in the coffin of the old social order. As the cost of a single day's work continued to climb, the return on investment for labor-saving machinery skyrocketed. In the pre-plague era, it was cheaper to hire 10 men than to build a complex water mill, but the scarcity arbitrage flipped that calculation on its head. We see a sudden explosion in the use of animal power, more efficient heavy plows, and mechanical sawmills as the elite tried to automate their way out of the labor crisis. This was the birth of the engineer as a primary driver of economic growth, as human muscle was slowly replaced by gears and pulleys. The high price of human capital was the primary catalyst for an industrial mindset that had been dormant for 1,000 years. But this drive for efficiency was about to hit the most information-dense sector of the medieval world. Nowhere was the labor shortage more acute than in the production of books, where a single volume could take a team of scribes months to complete. By the middle of the 15th century, the cost of copying text by hand had become an unsustainable luxury for a society that was rapidly becoming more literate and complex. Johannes Gutenberg's printing press was the ultimate capital substitution project, a machine designed to do the work of 1,000 monks at a fraction of the cost. This technology did not just democratize information. It performed a massive displacement of skilled labor that permanently lowered the price of knowledge. The printing press was a direct economic response to the fact that there were no longer enough cheap hands to keep up with the demand for data. This mechanical takeover of the intellect was just the beginning of a broader trend toward total technological displacement. The same logic of capital substitution drove a revolution in metallurgy and mining as the demand for metals for both war and industry grew. Deep shaft mining required advanced drainage pumps and ventilation systems that were expensive to build, but far cheaper than paying 100 miners to haul buckets by hand. These technical advancements allowed for the extraction of silver and copper at a scale that flooded the market with new currency, further accelerating the transition to a money-based economy. As the supply of precious metals increased, the inflation that followed acted as a final liquidation of the fixed-income nobility. The lords who relied on old, fixed rents found their wealth evaporating, while the merchants and skilled laborers saw their purchasing power grow. The very ground beneath the feet of the aristocracy was being mined for the capital that would eventually fund their replacement. When we look at the ruins of the feudal system, we're looking at a market that finally achieved equilibrium after a violent shock. The Black Death did not create wealth out of thin air, but it forced a radical redistribution of existing resources and a massive upgrade in human productivity. The forensic economist sees the Renaissance not as a sudden awakening of the human spirit, but as the result of a massive surplus of capital in the hands of a new middle class. This class had the discretionary income to spend on art, education, and luxury goods, creating the first genuine consumer market since the height of the Roman Empire. The great works of the 15th and 16th centuries were funded by the higher wages and better margins that the plague had made possible. This was the moment when the European economy stopped being a game of survival and started being a game of accumulation. The labor shortage acted as a powerful magnet, pulling people out of the stagnant countryside and into the dynamic urban centers. Cities became the hubs of the new cash economy, offering opportunities for social mobility that were impossible under the old manor system. In the city, a man was defined not by who his father was, but by the value of the skills he could sell in the marketplace. This concentration of human capital led to a rapid cycle of innovation and competition that would eventually propel Europe to global dominance. The urban middle class became the new engine of history, using their wealth to challenge the political power of the kings and the church. The city walls protected a new kind of freedom that was bought and paid for by the high price of labor. The lasting legacy of the Great Correction was a permanent increase in the floor of the human standard of living. Even as the population eventually began to recover, the structural changes to the economy, like the move to pastoral farming and the adoption of labor-saving tech, remained in place. The meat standard of the 14th century became the baseline for what a worker expected from their life and their employer. This expectation of a better life created a feedback loop of demand that drove the expansion of global trade and the age of exploration. The European consumer was born in the shadow of the plague, and their hunger for goods would eventually reshape the entire planet. The trauma of the mass mortality had been converted into a permanent upward pressure on the value of a human life. Viewed through the cold lens of the ledger, the Black Death was the most effective anti-poverty program in human history. It broke the back of a stagnant, extractive monopoly and replaced it with a competitive, innovation-driven market. The tragedy of the millions who died is undeniable, but the forensic reality is that their deaths created the economic space for the survivors to thrive. The market did not care about the suffering. It only cared about the fact that the supply of labor had fallen below the demand for it. This correction was a brutal, biological necessity that cleared the way for the modern world to emerge from the wreckage of the medieval. We are the heirs of a system that was built on the ruins of a world that was too small and too poor to survive. The history of the 14th century is a warning that no social contract is immune to the physics of supply and demand. The elite of that era believed their power was eternal, but they were defeated by a force that did not even know they existed. The Great Correction proved that when the cost of labor becomes too high, the world does not stop. It simply finds a better way to work. Every technological leap and every increase in the standard of living we enjoy today can be traced back to that moment of catastrophic liquidation. We are living in the long-term aftermath of a market that decided human beings were finally worth more than the land they walked on. The market always finds its equilibrium, even if it has to burn the old world down to find it.